What I am about to tell you now was sent to me by Andres, a retired doctor who spent more than 20 years working in rural towns before retiring in one of them. He wrote to me with that precision that doctors have to describe what they observe, without embellishments, without drama, just the facts in order. And yet, what he describes has no medical explanation that he himself can support. If you are subscribed to the channel, you already know that this type of testimony is what interests me the most. Rational people facing something that reason cannot cover. And if you are not subscribed yet, this story is a good reason to do so. This is what Andres experienced during the winter he spent alone in the mountains. I am a doctor. I was one for 31 years, and I say I was one because 3 years ago I retired, and since then I have been trying to convince myself that I no longer define my identity by that. I don't always succeed. I mention the doctor because it matters to understand how I process things. 31 years of rural medicine teach you to observe carefully, not to conclude before having enough information to distinguish between what you see and what you interpret. It's a training that becomes automatic, that enters into reflexes. When something happens, my first movement is neither fear nor a supernatural explanation. It is systematic observation. What happened to me in Paramo Grande resisted all my attempts at systematic observation. I moved to Paramo Grande when I retired, partly because I had spent 15 of my 31 years working in that municipality and the place had gotten under my skin, and partly because after decades in practice I wanted silence. Paramo Grande is a mountain village, over 2,000 meters high, with fog for most of the year, and a cold that is not aggressive but persistent, the kind that settles in your bones without you realizing it. About 300 people, a medical post where I had worked and where now a young doctor worked who didn't need my advice, although sometimes she asked for it out of courtesy. I settled in a house on the edge of the village, overlooking the hills and a garden that in spring had flowers I hadn't planted but the person who lived there before me had, and that returned on their own every year with that silent stubbornness of plants that have been in a place for a long time. The first months were exactly what I wanted. Tranquility, reading, walks in the hills, slow conversations with the townspeople I had known for years. Nothing extraordinary. The kind of life one imagines when saying they want to rest, which usually turns out to be more difficult to maintain than it seems, but in my case, perhaps because I was genuinely exhausted, it turned out to be perfect. I knew Doña Petra since my years as a doctor in the village. She was a woman of indeterminate age, one of those people who always seem to be 70 years old and will probably continue to seem that way for a long time. She lived alone in a house near the cemetery, cultivated a garden with a variety of plants that I, with my basic knowledge of medical botany, had never fully managed to identify, and had a reputation in the village that was difficult to categorize. Not exactly a healer, not exactly a witch, but something in the space between the two that the people of the village simply referred to as Doña Petra knows. What she knows exactly was something that no one could quite explain. But when someone had a problem that medicine could not solve, or a fear that could not be named, or a situation that escaped the usual frameworks, they went to see Doña Petra. I greeted her when I saw her. We had the cordial relationship of two people who respect each other without needing anything more. She had never asked me for anything, and I had never asked her anything. That changed in the second winter after my retirement. It started with the dog. I had a dog for a year, a large and calm animal, dark brown in color, that had shown up at my door one morning, with no visible owner, and had stayed with the same naturalness with which things that are meant to stay simply stay. I named him Medano, because he had the color of the sand from certain northern rivers where I had worked as a young man. Medano was a dog with a stable temperament. He didn't bark for no reason. He wasn't scared of the wind or the sounds of the mountain. He slept on the porch with that serenity of animals that feel completely secure in their territory. At the beginning of July, with winter already settled in the mountain, Medano started to behave differently. At first it was subtle. Certain moments when he would freeze, staring towards the northern hill, the one behind the house, with his ears up and his body tense. He didn't bark. He just watched. And when I approached to see what had caught his attention, I saw nothing. The hill covered with low vegetation and fog, as always. Then he started to not want to go out at night. Medano was a dog who enjoyed the cold nights, wandering the garden late and returning to sleep on the porch when his rounds were over. In July, he stopped doing that, As evening fell, he began to move restlessly, looking towards the door, and as soon as I opened it to let him out, he would stay at the threshold, looking outside, but without stepping out. If I went out first, he followed closely at my heels, not straying more than 2 meters away, with that body tension of animals on high alert. I observed him for several days before giving it importance. I looked for explanations. Some new animal in the hills, some scent that I couldn't detect, some change in the environment that Medano sensed before I did. I found no satisfactory explanation. The first week of August was when I saw him for the first time. It was around 11 at night. I had gone out to the garden to check that the water hose was properly closed, something I did out of habit because the early morning frosts could damage the pipes. Medano was following me closely, with that new tension he had adopted in the previous weeks. I looked towards the northern hill from the back of the garden, as I had done dozens of times, and at the edge of the hill, where the cultivated land ended and the wild vegetation began, there was a figure, a person, or what seemed to be a person, a dark silhouette standing completely still. The night fog made the edges diffuse, but the shape was unmistakably vertical, unmistakably human in its proportion. I stood still, watching. Medano began to tremble. Not a shiver from the cold, but the muscular tremor of an animal with genuine fear. That kind of involuntary response that animals cannot control even if they want to. The figure at the edge of the hill did not move. I waited a minute, maybe two, counting, observing, looking for any movement, any sign that it was a real person who had some understandable reason to be standing there at 11 o'clock at night in the cold of August. Nothing. I took Medano by the collar and entered the house. The next morning, I climbed up the northern hill to the point where I had seen the figure. I looked for footprints in the damp ground. I found none. The ground at that point was untouched, with the grass flattened only by the usual weight of moisture and wind, without any impression indicating that someone had been standing there. I returned home without a conclusion. The next thing took a week to happen, long enough for me to start thinking it had been a game of fog and shadow, an optical illusion produced by a tired brain in conditions of reduced visibility. It was the sound that changed that. In the second week of August, for 3 consecutive nights, I woke up at around 2 in the morning with the same feeling, that there was a sound outside that had interrupted my sleep. I didn't always remember the sound exactly upon waking, just the feeling that it had been real and that my brain had processed it even before I was fully conscious. On the third night, I stayed awake waiting, and it arrived. It was a sound difficult to describe precisely. Something between a whistle and a vocalization, with a low frequency that seemed to come from outside but resonated in a way that made it hard to pinpoint its exact origin. It wasn't the wind, which I knew well on that mountain after 2 years, and it wasn't any animal I could identify among those that inhabited the surrounding hills. It lasted perhaps 3 minutes. Then it stopped. Medano, who had been sleeping in the room with me those weeks because he had stopped accepting the porch, was awake and paralyzed, looking out the window. The next morning I went to see Doña Petra. I found her in her garden, with her hands in the soil, harvesting something I didn't recognize. When she saw me arrive, she was not surprised, as if she had been expecting that visit. She offered me tea, prepared it with some leaves she took from an unlabeled jar, and we sat at the small table in her kitchen. I told her everything. Medano's behavior, the figure on the hill, the sound in the early mornings. Doña Petra listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around the cup, looking at me with that particular attention of someone who listens not only to the words, but to what is behind them. When I finished, she remained silent for a moment. Then she asked, "Have you seen any new person wandering around the village in the last few weeks?" I thought. Paramo Grande was a village where new faces were noticeable. "There is a woman," I said. "She arrived about a month ago. She lives in the Gutierrez's house, which has been vacant since they went to the city. I don't know her name." Doña Petra nodded slowly. "Have you seen her up close?" "Only from afar, on the main street." I paused. "She is older, long hair, she always goes alone." Doña Petra fell silent for a moment that felt long. "Have you noticed anything in your animals when she passes by?" she asked. I thought of Medano, in the weeks of altered behavior. "The dog," I said. Doña Petra nodded. "Animals know before people do," she said. And then, choosing her words carefully, "There are people who have the gift of changing, of going out at night one way and another way. She paused. In this town, in the hills around here, that has always been known. There is a name for it, but the name doesn't matter. What matters is that it is known when one is near. A nagual? I said, because the term existed in my vocabulary, even though I had never taken it literally. Doña Petra looked at me with an expression that was hard to read. Something like that, she said. Although that word comes from another tradition and it's not exactly the same. What exists here is older than that name. What do you want from me? I asked, because something in everything Doña Petra was not saying pointed towards that. She lowered her gaze to her cup. You were a doctor here for a long time, she said. You knew a lot of people. You know things about many families in the village. A pause. There are those who seek that kind of knowledge. For someone to know the secrets of many people is something that holds value for certain purposes. I didn't respond immediately. I processed that with the part of my brain that has been systematic for decades. What kind of purposes? I don't want to speculate, Doña Petra said, but there are ways to obtain that knowledge that are not conversation. The tea had cooled in my cup without me having touched it. What do I do? I asked. Doña Petra got up, went to a high shelf, and brought back a bundle of dried herbs tied with black thread and a small cloth bag that weighed more than its size suggested. The herbs are burned inside the house, in every room, before sleeping. She handed them to me. The bag goes under the pillow. Do not open it. What's inside? Things you wouldn't recognize even if you saw them. Doña Petra looked directly at me. Do you trust me, doctor? It was the first time she had called me doctor in all the years we had known each other. Yes, I said. Then do not open it. I followed her instructions that night. I burned the herbs in every room, with the bitter, earthy smell filling the house, and placed the bag under the pillow. I felt, as I had felt before in similar situations, the rational discomfort of a man of science following instructions he could not verify, and something deeper, older than medical training, that recognized the seriousness of what I was doing. That night there was no sound in the early morning. The next one neither. On the third night, yes. But this time it was different. The sound started the same, that low and hard to locate vocalization, but it lasted less, and it had a different quality, as if it came from farther away, or as if something prevented it from arriving completely. It stopped before 2 minutes, abruptly, like when something is cut off halfway. Medano was still awake and tense, but he no longer trembled. The next day I went down to the village early and crossed paths on the main street with the woman that Doña Petra and I had mentioned. It was the first time I saw her up close. She was older, as I had said, with completely white hair, straight and long down to her shoulders. She walked slowly, with a shopping bag, and when I passed by her side, she looked up and stared at me. She had very light brown eyes, almost yellow, that shone in the morning light, in a way that was not exactly normal, but also not unequivocally abnormal, just striking. She looked at me for the second that our paths crossed, and in that second, I saw something I didn't know how to process. No hostility, no threat, but recognition, as if she knew exactly who I was and what I had done those last nights, and was assessing what that meant. I walked past. I didn't stop. That afternoon I saw Doña Petra again and told her about the encounter. She listened to me and then said, "You know she has protection." A pause. People like her don't insist when they know there's someone who understands what's happening. They look for places where no one knows. Will she leave the town? I asked. Probably. Doña Petra looked at me. But doctor, one more thing. She got up and went to a kitchen drawer, took something out, and brought it to me. It was a folded sheet of paper. This is in case you see something again on the northern hill, in case the sound returns. She handed it to me. These are words that are said aloud, looking toward where the sound comes from. You don't need to understand them, just say them. I took the paper, I opened it. There were some lines written in a mix of Spanish and something else I didn't recognize, in a handwriting that wasn't Doña Petra's but older, as if she had copied something from another document. How long have these words been in your family? I asked, because something in that handwriting told me they had history. Doña Petra smiled slightly, the first time I had seen her smile in this entire conversation. More than I care to tell, she said. I put the paper away. The woman with the white hair left the Gutierrez house 10 days after our encounter on the street. She simply left, without notifying anyone, leaving the house exactly as she had found it. The only trace of her stay was a persistent smell in one of the rooms that the owner of the house, when he returned to check it, described as burnt earth, and something else he could not name. The nighttime sounds ceased completely. Medano regained his usual temperament in less than a week. He returned to the porch, resumed his nighttime rounds, and returned to that stable serenity he had before July. I continued burning the herbs that Doña Petra had given me once a week until they ran out. The cloth bag remains under my pillow. I have not opened it. I am a doctor. I have spent 31 years looking at the human body with the conviction that everything has an explanation if one searches carefully enough. And I still believe that, in the broadest sense. But there is a space between what science can verify today and what exists in the world, and that space is not small. What happened in Paramo Grande that winter lived in that space. I have no diagnosis for that, and for the first time in 31 years, the absence of a diagnosis does not bother me. My son Tomas came to visit me in September, when winter was already easing. He is a doctor too, like me, and we spent a long afternoon drinking coffee and talking about work, about his life in the city, about changes in the healthcare system. At some point he asked me how life was in the village. I told him it was fine, that it was quiet. I didn't tell him anything about what had happened. There are things that need the right context to be heard, and my son has not yet reached that point in his life where certain contexts open up on their own. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. What I do know is that when Thomas left and I was alone in the house with Medano sleeping on the porch and the mountain night outside, I sat in the garden and looked at the northern hill for a good while. It was still, dark, the fog moving slowly over the vegetation. Nothing. And yet, before going in, I took Doña Petra's paper out of the pocket where I've kept it since that afternoon, and I read it aloud once, looking towards the hill, just in case. The words I don't understand but say anyway. Because there are things that medical training does not cover, and that are better handled with the kind of knowledge that takes longer to acquire in the world. That's all I have to say. Thus ends Andres' story. He wrote to me that he still lives in Paramo Grande, that Medano is doing well, and that Doña Petra and he have tea from time to time without talking much about that. He says that is enough. It seems to me that what weighs most in this story is not the threat itself, but what it demanded from a man used to explaining everything, to accept that there is knowledge older than his own, and to trust in it. If this story resonated with you in any way, I would like to read it in the comments. And if you have something stored that no one has heard yet, you know where to find me. Have a good night. We'll talk in the next one. Before starting this story, I want to tell you something. Not everyone who writes to me does so to impress anyone. Some do it because they need someone else to know what they experienced, even if it's a stranger on the other side of the screen. That's how I received the message from Andres, an accountant from Guadalajara, Mexico, who wrote to me one weeknight with few introductory words and a lot of detail in what followed. If you're subscribed to the channel, thank you for being here. And if you arrived today for the first time, this is a good story to stay for. What Andres experienced during the weeks after his family moved to a new house is the kind of experience that forever changes the way one looks at the dark corners of their own home. I am an accountant. I work with numbers, with balances, with logical structures that have to add up to the cent. My brain works that way. It seeks order, identifies inconsistencies, solves problems methodically. I am not a person who is swayed by impressions or gut feelings. Lucia, my wife, always told me that I was the kind of person who needed to see something 3 times before believing it. She was right. Until I experienced something that no matter how many times I saw it, it remained just as impossible. It all started with the move. Lucia and I had been looking for our own house for 4 years. We lived in a rented apartment in a central area of Guadalajara that felt small and consumed a considerable part of our monthly income. When we found the house in the southern neighborhood of the city, we both knew it was what we were looking for. 2 stories, 3 bedrooms, a small garden in the back, a reasonable price for the size and location. It was a quiet neighborhood, with well-maintained houses from the 70s, with trees on the sidewalks that provided shade to the street during the day. We bought it in July. We moved in August, in the middle of the heat. The first days were the usual chaos of any move. Boxes everywhere, furniture in temporary positions, The feeling of living inside something that still wasn't completely yours but was slowly taking the shape of a home. Lucia took care of the kitchen and the bedrooms. I took care of the living room, the study, and the utility arrangements. We slept well those first nights, with the productive tiredness of someone who has done concrete things during the day. The house smelled of fresh paint. The previous owner had repainted it before selling it to us. Clean white walls that gave it a fresh and neutral look. There was something pleasant about that smell, about that whiteness, the feeling of a space without history, of a place that had not yet accumulated anything. Later I understood that this feeling was completely wrong. The first sign was Lucia. My wife is intuitive in a way that I have always found difficult to categorize. She wasn't exactly superstitious, didn't believe in astrology or rituals, but she did have a sensitivity to spaces and people that I lacked. She would enter a place and say, "Something isn't right here," or "I feel comfortable here," with a certainty that often turned out to have some real basis that I had not perceived. I attributed it to her ability to read subtle details that I overlooked. The temperature, the light, the way people moved in a space. 5 days after we moved in, Lucia told me that the bedroom on the ground floor, which we had designated as the guest room, made her uncomfortable. Uncomfortable how? I asked. I can't explain it well. When I go in there, I feel like the air is different, heavier. I told her it was probably the ventilation. That bedroom had only one small window that faced the side garden, while the others had larger windows. The logic of air circulation perfectly explained the difference in temperature and density. Lucia looked at me with that expression of hers that meant she accepted my explanation but didn't find it sufficient. We didn't talk about the subject anymore that night. 2 days later, Lucia told me something different about the same room. "Andres, last night I dreamed about that bedroom." "What did you dream?" "That I was inside and there was someone standing in the corner. A man. I couldn't see him well because it was dark, but he was there, standing, looking at me." I asked her how she had felt in the dream. She told me that she hadn't been exactly afraid, but rather something more like the discomfort of feeling watched without consent. I told her it was normal to dream about new spaces while the brain processed them. That our mind takes time to incorporate new places and sometimes populates them with things during the night. Lucia nodded, but remained silent for the rest of breakfast. The first concrete thing I couldn't explain happened a week after the move. It was 11 at night, on a Tuesday. Lucia was already asleep upstairs. I was in the study finishing a report that I had to submit the next day. The study was on the ground floor, next to the guest room. I worked for an hour with concentration, not paying attention to the rest of the house. When I finished and turned off the computer, in the silence that followed the noise of the fan from the equipment, I heard something. It was a very low sound, almost at the limit of perception, like someone breathing, slow and steady, in the next room. I stood still, listening. The sound continued. It was rhythmic, consistent, with the cadence of someone sleeping, or completely still but awake. Too regular to be the wind, too organic to be any mechanical system in the house. I slowly got up and went to the guest room door. It was closed. I put my hand on the doorknob and waited a moment, listening from the hallway. The sound was coming from inside, without a doubt. I burst open the door and turned on the light. The room was empty, the bed unmade, the boxes we still hadn't unpacked piled against the wall. No one, nothing out of place. The sound had disappeared the moment I turned on the light. I stayed in the doorway for a while, scanning the room with my eyes, looking for anything that could explain what I had heard. Nothing. I closed the door and went up to the master bedroom. Lucia was sleeping peacefully. I lay down carefully so as not to wake her, and spent some time staring at the ceiling before falling asleep. I didn't say anything the next day. I didn't want to worry her about something that probably had an explanation that I hadn't found yet. But in the following days, more things piled up that also found no explanation. On Wednesday, the guest room door, which I had closed before going to bed, was open the next morning. Not wide open, but ajar, about 20 centimeters. On Thursday, Lucia told me that the night before, while I was sleeping, she had woken up and felt that there was someone else in the bedroom. She hadn't seen anything, but the feeling had been so clear that she had turned on the light and checked the whole room. On Friday, I myself had the dream. It was the same one that Lucia had described to me, a figure standing in the dark corner of the guest room, looking towards where I was. In my version of the dream, the figure was more defined than in Lucia's description. It was a man, tall, wearing dark clothes that could have been from any era because there were no clear details. He was doing nothing. He was just there, with total and fixed attention directed at me, with something in that attention that was not exactly hostility, but something colder and older than hostility. I woke up with my heart racing. Lucia was awake too, looking at me. "You dreamed of him too," she said. It was not a question. "How do you know?" "Your face when I woke you up. It's the same face I made." I sat on the bed and spent a moment in silence processing everything. The sounds, the door, the parallel dreams, Lucia's discomfort from the first day. "I'm going to check the house," I said. "I already know what you're going to find," Lucia said. "Nothing, or nothing you can see." She was right about the first part. I checked the entire ground floor, starting with the guest room, then the study, the kitchen, the living room. Nothing out of place. Doors and windows closed. No signs of entry. That morning, Saturday, I went out for a walk around the neighborhood under the pretext of exploring the area, but with the real intention of clearing my head and thinking clearly. It was early. The street was almost empty, with the smell of wet earth from the gardens that the neighbors had watered. On the sidewalk across the street, sitting in a plastic chair in front of his door, was an old man who watched me approach with the calm attention of someone who has all the time in the world. "Good day," I said. "Good day," he replied. "You are the one who bought the Mondragon house." The Mondragon was the surname of the previous owners. I told you yes. Don Ezequiel. He introduced himself without getting up from the chair. We talked for a few minutes about the neighborhood, about the improvements that had been made in recent years. Don Ezequiel was a measured man, with precise words, who looked at his interlocutor with an attention that uncomfortably reminded me of the figure from the dream, although I quickly told myself it was an unfair association born from fatigue. He was the one who brought up the topic without me saying anything. "How have you slept in the house?" I looked at him. "More or less," I said cautiously. Don Ezequiel nodded slowly. "The downstairs bedroom," he said. It was not a question. I stayed silent for a moment. "What do you know about that bedroom?" Don Ezequiel looked towards the house with an evaluative expression. "I know what everyone who has been on this street for years knows. That room has had something for a long time, since before the Mondragon family, since the family that lived there before them, who built the house." I asked him what it was. Don Ezequiel took a moment before answering, as if he were carefully choosing how much to say. "The man who built that house in the 70s died inside it, in that room. Natural causes, they said. But his family always said that in his last weeks that man had changed in a way that didn't correspond to any illness. That he would lock himself in that room for hours, that he talked to himself, that he said things that didn't make sense. His family thought it was the deterioration of old age. But the eldest daughter, already old herself before she died, told anyone who would listen that her father hadn't died alone in that room. What did she mean by that? That there was something with him, that she had seen him once, standing in the corner while her father was sitting on the bed looking at him. That he was a dark man who did not belong to that house or to any place she could name. The cold I felt at that moment was not the cold of the early morning in Guadalajara. It was another kind of cold, internal, that comes when something one tried to keep in the category of inexplicable but probably rational suddenly shifts to a completely different category. "And the Mondragon?" I asked. "Did they see him too?" "The Mondragon never used that room. They had it locked. Mr. Mondragon once told me that when they bought the house, the real estate agent mentioned to them that there were some stories about that room, but that they were just rumors from neighbors. Mondragon locked the room and never thought about it again. But his children never wanted to sleep in that part of the house." I asked Don Ezequiel if there was anything that could be done. The old man looked at me for a moment. "There is a lady in the Americana neighborhood who handles these kinds of things. She is not a healer or anything like that. She is a woman who studied these situations for many years and knows how to manage them. If you give me her number, I will call her myself to explain." I agreed. Don Ezequiel went into his house and returned with a phone number written on a piece of paper. He handed it to me without further ceremony. That afternoon, I told Lucia everything. I told her about the sounds, the door, and what Don Ezequiel had said about the man who died in that room, and the figure his daughter had seen in the corner. Lucia listened to me in silence. When I finished, she said, "I already knew. Not what you just told me, but that there was something, since the first day." "I know. What are we going to do?" "Call the lady that Don Ezequiel recommended." Lucia nodded. The lady's name was Amparo. She was in her 50s, spoke with academic precision, and when she arrived at the house the next day, the first thing she did was ask me to show her every room without telling her anything about which one concerned us. She wanted to reach her own conclusions without me contaminating them. I followed her around the upstairs without her saying anything special. Then we went down to the ground floor. She passed through the kitchen, the living room, the study, and when she reached the closed door of the guest room, she stopped without me saying anything. "This one," she said. Yes, Amparo opened the door and entered. I stayed in the doorway, observing. She moved slowly around the room, stopping especially in the corner where the figure of the dream always stood, and passed her hands through the air of that corner with a concentration that was not theatrical but completely functional, like a doctor palpating something that her hands know better than her eyes. Then she left and closed the door. "There is a presence," she said in the hallway, with the same calmness with which she could say there was dampness in the wall. "Masculine, ancient. It has been in that corner for a long time. I don't think it is the person who died in that room, or not just that person. I believe what is there is older, and that the man who died simply found it, just like you did." I asked her what exactly it was that he had found. Amparo chose her words carefully. "There are things that settle in places for reasons we cannot always trace. Some came because someone invoked them. Others simply find a space where the energy is favorable to them and stay. What is in that room belongs to the second category, I believe. It has no specific intention to cause harm, but its presence generates a disturbance in the people who sleep nearby because it radiates something that the nervous system perceives as a threat, even though it is not in the strict sense. Can it be removed? It can be limited, and it can be instructed that it does not have access to the rest of the house or to the people who live in it. It is not always possible to completely expel something that has been in a place for so long, but a boundary can be established. What Amparo did during the next hour, I will not describe in detail because there are parts that I did not understand well enough to explain them accurately. What I can say is that she mainly worked in the corner of that room, with items she brought in a cloth bag, and that when the room was finished it felt different in a way that I didn't expect to perceive but did nonetheless. Lighter, more neutral, as if something that had been there accumulating presence for years had receded to a distance that no longer reached the threshold of the door. Amparo told us that the bedroom could be used, but that it was preferable not to sleep there for at least a month. That what she had done was establish boundaries, not eliminate the presence, and that it needed time to settle. She also told us something I didn't expect, that the dream we both had, the figure in the corner, was probably the way that presence communicated its existence. Not with the intention to scare, but because it was the only form of contact it had with sleeping people, to show itself in the space where dreams occur. "Do you know what it's doing?" I asked, unable to help myself. "Is it aware?" Amparo looked at me with an expression that wasn't exactly patience but was close to it. "That question doesn't have a simple answer. What I know is that it responds to limits, and that's enough to work with it." A month passed, then another. We didn't hear the breathing again. We didn't have the dream again. The guest room door stopped opening by itself. We used that room for the first time as a guest room in December when Lucia's mom came to spend the holidays. We didn't tell her anything about what had happened. She slept well every night, reporting nothing strange. But Lucia and I know that something is still there. Not because we feel it with the same intensity as in the early days, but because there are moments, very occasional, when passing by that closed door, I sense something that has no exact name. A quality in the air, a change in temperature of a degree or two, the brief feeling of being aware of something that is also aware of me. It happens in a second and then it goes away. Amparo told us that there would probably always be some of that the presence would not disappear but would remain contained, and that as long as we respected the boundaries she had established, what remained there would respect ours. We have been in that house for a year and a half. We have made it our own. The furniture has found its permanent place. The backyard now has plants that Lucia tends to with dedication. The study has become my favorite space for work. It's a house with history, like all old houses. Only ours has a story that most of the neighbors know and that we know too, in a way more direct than we would have preferred. That's all Andres wanted to tell me. Andres closed the message with an observation that I haven't been able to get out of my head. He said that the most disturbing part of the whole experience wasn't the figure in the dreams or the sounds at night, but realizing that something had been in that corner for decades, watching all the families that had lived in that house, and that none of them knew it completely. That ignorance didn't make it any less real. It seems to me a very honest way to end a story like that. If you've ever bought a house or rented an apartment and felt from the beginning that something wasn't quite right, I would like to read it. The comments are there. We'll talk soon. I want to start this story by warning you about something. The person who sent it to me does not believe in ghosts, or at least he didn't believe before moving into the Monte Cristo building. His name is Andres. He is 41 years old, works as a civil engineer, and wrote to me from Mexico City a couple of months ago with a tale that I reread 3 times before deciding to narrate it. If you are listening to this and have ever felt that a place has something that cannot be explained with logic, I would like you to tell me about it in the comments. That is exactly what Andres felt, and he is the last person you would expect to say something like that. Make yourself comfortable. What follows happened during the 4 months that Andres lived on the 12th floor of that building, and neither of us knows for sure what was inhabiting there with him. I am an engineer. I say this from the beginning because it matters to understand what kind of mind I process things with. I spent 5 years studying structures, calculus, and material strength. My job consists of visiting construction sites, reviewing numbers, identifying failures in systems that other people do not see. I am, in the most literal sense of the word, someone trained to find rational explanations for problems. What happens to a building always has a concrete cause: poor design, deficient materials, construction errors, wear over time. There is never a mystery in buildings. There are only data that have not yet been read well. With that mindset, I arrived at Monte Cristo. I moved there in January. I had just finished a long contract in Guadalajara and had secured a new job in the city. Elena, my wife, would stay in Guadalajara for 3 more months, finishing her own matters before joining me. I needed a temporary apartment, something furnished, central, and uncomplicated. El Monte Cristo met all those requirements. It was a building from the 60s in the Colonia Narvarte, 15 stories, gray stone facade, electric doorman, and a decent view from the upper floors. The price was reasonable for the area, which should have made me wonder why, but I didn't ask. The apartment was 12B, 4th floor from the top. Living room, dining room, 1 bedroom, small kitchen, and a bathroom with tiles from the 80s that nobody had changed. It was clean, furnished with basic functional things. The lady from the agency handed me the keys on a Tuesday afternoon and told me that the building manager was named Don Prospero and lived on the ground floor, and that any problem I had I could knock on his door. She gave me a 4-month contract. I signed. I carried up my suitcases. I poured myself a glass of tap water and looked out the living room window at the rooftops of the neighborhood. The first night I slept well. The second night too. On the third night at 2:15 in the morning, according to the phone I was charging on the nightstand, I was awakened by a sound. It was a thud. Dry, singular, coming from the bedroom wall. The wall that faced the exterior hallway of the building, not the neighboring apartment. I stayed listening in the darkness for several minutes. Nothing else. I told myself it could have been anything. Contraction of materials due to the nighttime temperature change, something that fell in another apartment and resonated through the structure, the elevator making some maneuver. Old building speak. Any engineer knows that. I turned over and fell asleep. Several days went by without anything happening. I was settling into the routine of the new city. Early office, late return, solitary dinner, call with Elena before sleeping. The apartment was fine. A bit cold at night, noticeably colder than what the thermostat justified, but I attributed it to the poor insulation of the old building. There were drafts that I couldn't pinpoint precisely, which was a bit strange since all the windows closed well, but it wasn't something that kept me awake at night. I met Don Prospero a week after I arrived. I found him in the lobby sweeping with a calmness that seemed to have been cultivated over decades. He was a man in his 70s, short, with copper-colored skin and huge hands. He greeted me with a nod and asked if I had been given everything necessary for the apartment. I told him yes. He asked if there was any problem. I said none, just that the room got quite cold at night. He nodded slowly. He said, "Everyone says the same about 12B. I asked him if there was a particular reason. He looked at me in a way that was hard to describe, as if he were assessing how much he wanted to tell me. Then he said, "The building is old. There are places like that." And he continued sweeping. I didn't think much of it at the time. The first event that really made me feel something was the one with the mirror. 3 weeks had passed since my arrival. It was a Friday night and I had come home late from work, exhausted. I took a shower, dried off, and as I left the bathroom, I passed by the full-length mirror that was in the hallway between the bathroom and the bedroom. I caught a glimpse of myself for a second just passing by. And in that second, in that fraction of a second before I looked away, I saw something behind me in the reflection. It was small, about the height of an 8 or 10-year-old child. It was about 3 meters behind me at the point where the hallway turned toward the living room, and by the time I turned around, there was nothing. I stood in that hallway for a time I couldn't calculate. Then I went to the living room. I checked behind the sofa, behind the curtains, under the dining table. Nothing. I went back to the bathroom and checked there too. Nothing. I told myself it had been an optical illusion, the visual fatigue of a long day, perhaps the reflection of something in the partially open window of the living room. Mirrors and moving objects create all kinds of illusions. I know this because there are studies about it. I went to sleep convinced that there was nothing, but I didn't sleep well that night. I had the feeling for hours that someone was standing next to my bed. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything. It was just a pressure on my consciousness, like when you know someone is watching you in a public space and you turn around to confirm it. That same certainty, held for hours, without confirmation and without rest. The next day I called Elena and didn't tell her anything. I don't know exactly why. I suppose I didn't want to sound like someone who, in their first month of living alone, is already seeing things in the mirrors. During the following week, 3 small things happened that I cataloged at the time as unrelated. The first, I found the bedroom door closed when I got home from work one Wednesday. I never closed that door. There was no reason to do so. I lived alone. I tried to remember if I had closed it in the morning without thinking. I didn't remember, neither one way nor the other. The second, on Wednesday night, before falling asleep, I heard from somewhere in the apartment, faint but perfectly audible, what sounded like a child's voice humming, not a recognizable melody, just repeated irregular notes like someone humming without intention. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. I got up and walked around the apartment. The sound did not repeat. I checked if any neighbor could have produced it. The apartment above was unoccupied according to what Don Prospero had told me, and the one below was inhabited by an older couple who never made noise. The third, on Friday while preparing breakfast, I found on the kitchen countertop a mark that hadn't been there the night before. It was a small imprint, like that of a child's hand, in the fine dust that accumulates on kitchen surfaces even when one cleans them. The fingers were short and spread apart. I took a photo of it with my phone. I don't know why I photographed it. I suppose some part of me already knew I wanted to have a record of something, even though I didn't yet know what it was. That weekend, I went down to talk to Don Prospero. I found him in his room on the ground floor, a small room with a TV on, and the smell of reheated coffee. I told him I wanted to ask him something about the apartment. He gestured for me to sit down. I offered him coffee. I accepted even though I didn't feel like having coffee. I asked him directly if anything had happened in 12B, any prior issues, any previous tenant who had had problems. Don Prospero took his cup. He looked at the turned-off television for a moment. Then he said to me, "What did you see?" I described to him the reflection in the mirror, the humming, the footprint. He listened without interrupting me. When I finished, he nodded as if nothing I had told him surprised him. He then told me that the 12B had a history that the real estate agency did not mention because the real estate agency never mentioned it in any of its buildings. 17 years ago, a 9-year-old boy named Tomas had died in that apartment. Not by violence, Don Prospero clarified before I could ask. It was an illness, one of those fast-moving diseases that progress before doctors understand what they are seeing. The boy had lived there with his mother, and he had spent the last weeks of his life in that bedroom, in that bed, looking at that ceiling. I asked him if the mother was still in the building. Don Prospero said no. He said the woman had left 2 months after the child's death and that he never heard from her again. He said that since then, the apartment had a high turnover of tenants. No one stayed more than a few months. When I asked him why, he told me that most said the apartment felt uncomfortable, that they didn't feel alone, that they didn't sleep well. Only one, he said, had been more specific. He had said he saw a child standing in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, That man left the next day. I remained silent for a while after hearing that. Then I asked Don Prospero what he thought, if he believed there was something in the apartment. He looked at me with those eyes that I already knew were assessing how much to say. And he said, "What I think doesn't matter. What matters is what you are going to do." I returned to the apartment and sat in the living room with the light on even though it was daytime. I analyzed everything with the methodology I use for work problems: known facts, possible hypotheses, available evidence. The facts: a child had died in that apartment. I had seen something in the mirror, heard something, found a footprint. Rational hypotheses: fatigue, suggestibility, dust in an accidental configuration. Irrational hypotheses: the child was still there somehow. I did not believe in the second hypothesis, but I also could not completely refute what I had seen and heard. I decided to stay, for two reasons. One, because changing apartments involved a logistics that I did not have time to manage. And two, because something in me, that engineer's instinct that needs to understand systems before abandoning them, wanted to know more. What followed in the days after was a gradual escalation that, looking back, had a logic that I could not see at the time. First, it was the temperature. The nighttime cold in the bedroom intensified to the point that I could no longer attribute it to insulation. I ended up buying a second comforter, and still, I would wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning with a feeling of cold in my hands and face that the comforter did not cover. It was a localized cold, as if a window were open right above me, even though there was no window in that position. Then it was the smell. It appeared and disappeared without pattern. It was something I took days to identify. The smell of a hospital, that specific scent of disinfectant and plastic and something else beneath it that one associates with places where people are sick. It wasn't strong. It was barely perceptible, as if someone had brought it there on their clothes a long time ago and the materials had absorbed it and were slowly releasing it. I opened the windows. The smell always returned. And then, on the third night after speaking with Don Prospero, I saw it. It was 3:20 in the morning. I had woken up, as always, because of the cold. I was lying on my side looking towards the bedroom door, which was slightly open. And in the frame of that door, with the little light that came in from the hallway, I saw the silhouette of a child. He was standing still, with his arms pressed against his body. I couldn't see his features in the darkness. He was small, about the height that Don Prospero had described as that of a 9-year-old child. He wasn't moving. He was just there. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I think the body, in those extreme situations, chooses immobility over anything else. I stayed exactly in the position I was in, looking at that silhouette. And the silhouette was looking at me, or so I assumed because I couldn't see his eyes. It lasted, I estimate, about 2 minutes. Then, without me doing anything, without anything changing in the environment, the silhouette was no longer there. It didn't disappear dramatically. It didn't fade away or move. One moment it was there and the next it wasn't, like when you stop seeing something because the light changes slightly. I stayed awake until dawn. In the morning I called Elena. This time I did tell her. I told her everything from the mirror to that night. She listened to me in silence throughout the narration. When I finished, she said to me with a calmness I appreciated, "Andres, what do you think it is?" I told her I didn't know. She said, "Do you think it wants to harm you?" I thought about that. I replied that no, I hadn't felt that way at any moment. That it was rather a presence. Something that was there and knew that I was there too. Elena was silent for a moment and then said, "Then maybe it just is." I didn't know what to do with that, but I couldn't argue against it either. The following days I spent in a constant state of alertness that was exhausting. I looked at every corner before entering each room. I checked the doorframe before falling asleep. Nothing. The boy, or whatever it was, did not reappear visibly for almost 2 weeks, but it was still there. I knew it by the cold, by the smell that came and went, by a feeling I learned to recognize during those weeks. A kind of weight in the air, very subtle, that changed the quality of the silence inside the apartment. Empty spaces sound different when they are only empty of people. This one sounded different in another way. I made a decision that at that moment seemed reasonable to me, and that now I don't know how to evaluate. I decided to talk to it. It was a Thursday night. I was sitting in the living room with the phone in my hand, about to call Elena, When I felt the weight in the air that I already knew, I stayed still, and in a low voice, without getting up from the sofa, I said, "I know you're there." Silence. I said, "I'm not going to do anything to you. You don't have to hide." Nothing for a while. Then from the bedroom, that humming, the same irregular notes from the previous weeks. It lasted longer this time, maybe 2 minutes. And there was something in the irregularity of those notes that I began to hear differently. Not like a formless melody, but like someone humming what they remember of something. What remains of a song when one can no longer reconstruct it completely. I said, "It's okay." I don't really know what I meant by that. I guess it was the only thing that came out. The humming stopped. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. What happened during the following month is difficult to narrate in a linear way because it was not linear. It was a coexistence. That is the word that best describes it. The boy, Tomas, was still there, and I was still there, and we found a kind of coexistence that I had not planned and did not know how to name. The cold continued at night, but I was getting used to it. The smell of the hospital appeared and disappeared, but it no longer generated the same visceral reaction in me. Every few days I found something slightly moved from its place. A glass on a different shelf. A chair turned a few degrees. My coat on the hook on the right instead of the left where I always left it. I saw him 3 more times during that month. The first time was in the kitchen at night, and it was very brief. Just a second before I turned on the light and the space was left empty. The second time was in the living room, sitting on the floor next to the turned-off television, in the posture of someone looking at something that isn't there. It lasted longer this time, almost a minute. He didn't move. Neither did I. Then he left. The third time was different. I was reading in the armchair in the living room late, with a lamp on. I felt the change in the air and looked towards the hallway. The boy was there, standing as always, but this time I had more light to see him than before. And this time I could see something I hadn't been able to see before. His face. It was the face of a child. Dark eyes. An expression that was neither fear nor sadness, but something that resembled concentration, like someone making a sustained effort. He was looking directly at me. I looked back at him, and in that exchange of glances, which lasted perhaps 20 seconds, I felt something I didn't expect to feel. Not terror, something more like sorrow. A huge sorrow with no clear recipient that rose from somewhere in my chest and stayed there. The boy extended an arm. Not towards me, but to the side, towards the hallway wall. And then, like the previous times, he was no longer there. I sat with the closed book in my hands for a long while. Then I got up and went to the point on the wall where he had pointed. It was a stretch of wall between the hallway and the entrance to the bedroom, without pictures or furniture. The paint was slightly darker in a rectangle about 40 centimeters by 30, as if something had been hanging there for a long time and the rest of the wall had yellowed around it. I went to see Don Prospero the next day. I described to him what I had seen, the gesture, the wall, the mark. I asked him if he knew what had been hanging there. Don Prospero looked at me for a moment before saying, "The mother had a picture of the boy there, a large framed photograph. She took it when she left." He paused. It was the only photo in the whole apartment. I didn't know what to do with that information. I still don't know what to do with it. I don't know if the boy was pointing to the photo because he missed it, because he wanted me to know who he was, or for some other reason that I couldn't grasp. I don't know if what I saw was the spirit of Tomas, an echo of something that happened there 17 years ago, a construction of my own mind operating under weeks of sleep deprivation and suggestibility, or something completely different that none of those categories describe well. What I do know is what happened the last night. Elena arrived in the city 3 weeks earlier than planned because her work was resolved sooner than expected. She called to let me know and arrived the next day with her suitcases. I welcomed her with a mix of relief and something I can only describe as worry, although I wasn't clear about whom it was for. That first night, the two of them slept in the bedroom of 12B. Elena fell asleep quickly as she always does. I took longer. At 2 in the morning, I woke up, as always, from the cold. I glanced at the doorframe by reflex. The boy was there. But something was different. His posture was not like the previous times. He was slightly hunched over, with his head tilted, and although I couldn't see his face clearly in the dark, I had the impression that he was looking at Elena sleeping instead of looking at me. And something in that image, something I can't rationally justify but that was absolutely physical in my body, made me feel an urgency I had never felt before. In a very low voice, almost soundless, I said to him, "No." There was a pause that seemed long. Then the cold disappeared, not gradually, all at once, as if someone had closed a window. The air in the room normalized in seconds. The doorframe was empty. That was 2 months ago. Since that night, nothing. The apartment feels different. Not completely empty, or maybe it is. And I have gotten so used to the weight in the air that its absence is what now feels strange. Elena hasn't seen or heard anything. When I asked her if she had noticed anything odd in the apartment, she said no, that it seemed a bit cold to her, but nothing more. We ended the lease and moved to another place 3 weeks ago. I don't know if what happened in 12B has an explanation. I don't know if Tomas is still there, waiting for something that never comes, or if he somehow left. I don't know if what I saw that last night was dangerous, or if I misinterpreted something that was completely harmless. What I do know is that I am an engineer. I spend my days measuring structures and calculating loads and predicting how systems behave under pressure. And I have no framework, no professional tools, no methodology that allows me to explain what happened in that apartment during those 4 months. And that, the lack of explanation, is perhaps what I struggle with the most. That, and the image of that child watching my wife sleep, and me telling him no, and for him to listen to me. That's all Andres wrote to me. He told me at the end of the message that he had never told this complete story, not even to Elena, and that writing it took him 3 days. What stayed with me the most was that last image, an engineer, a man who built his life on logic, negotiating in the dark with something that his training has no way of naming. If you've ever lived in a place that felt inhabited in a way you couldn't explain, I would love for you to tell me about it. The comments are there for that. And if you want to keep hearing stories like this, you know where to stay. Take care. Rest well. We'll hear from each other in the next story. What I am about to narrate now was sent to me by a follower named Sofia from Peru. And it is different from most of the stories I receive because it does not take place in an old house or an abandoned place. It happens right in the city in a completely normal office job during a night shift. Sofia is 34 years old and worked for 8 months as an operator in an emergency call center. She tells me that she quit without notice, without a letter, without explanation. She just didn't come back. And what made her leave had to do with a call she received one early morning in October, and with what she discovered about that call the next day. If you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel. We publish often. Now, let's go with what happened to Sofia. I started working at the emergency call center in February, and by October I already knew the job well enough to have lost the initial fear. It is important that you understand this, because what happened was not the result of a nervous or suggestible person. By the time that early morning arrived, I had already taken calls about serious accidents, fires, and people in crisis. I had already developed that shield that one builds over the months to be able to do that job without breaking down. It was practice, it was efficient, and I was proud of that. My name is Sofia. I was 31 years old at that time. I studied communications, ended up working in the call center out of economic necessity, and discovered that I was good at it. I had a clear voice, precise diction, and the ability to stay calm while coordinating resources. The night supervisor, a man named Rodrigo, had told me in my 6-month evaluation that I was one of his best operators. That mattered to me. The night shift was from 11 at night to 7 in the morning. It wasn't anyone's favorite shift, but it paid 20% more. And at that point in my life, money mattered more than sleep. I adapted to the schedule, just as one ends up adapting to almost everything. The night of October 16th started like all the others. I arrived at 10:40, took over from the operator who was leaving, checked the board of available resources, put on my headphones, and started. The first hours were active. A traffic accident near downtown, 2 noise complaints that resolved themselves, a medical emergency in an apartment building that required coordination with healthcare staff. The kind of night that keeps you alert, but doesn't exhaust you. By 2 in the morning, the flow had calmed down. Rodrigo was in the supervision room at the back, visible through the glass. The other 2 operators on shift, Javier and Paula were at their posts with expressions of those who have spent too many hours in front of a screen. The room had that particular silence of working early mornings, constant white lights, the soft hum of the equipment, the artificial chill of the air conditioning that Rodrigo always set too high. At 2:17 in the morning, the call came in. There was nothing unusual about how it arrived. The tone in my earpiece, the number appearing on my screen, the line opening. All normal. "Emergency center, what is your situation?" I said. Silence. Not a silence of a disconnected line, but the silence of someone who is there, who is listening, who has called but is not speaking. This happens with some frequency, especially in crisis calls where the person needs a few seconds before they can articulate something. "I'm here," I said, in the tone we use for those cases, calm and without urgency. "Take the time you need." A moment. Then, very softly, almost inaudible, a voice. It was a woman's voice. Or at least that was what I registered in that first instant, although in the second that followed I was not so sure. It had something in the texture that didn't quite fit into any clear category. It was old but not fragile. It was soft, but with something beneath the softness that was something completely different. She said 3 words. "I see you now." Nothing more. Just that. I paused for a second without responding, which was not my habit. The protocol for silent or incoherent calls was clear. Keep the line open, try to obtain location. Do not hang up until there is enough information to assess whether it was necessary to send resources. "Can you tell me where you are?" I asked, following the protocol. Silence. "Do you need help?" Silence. And then the voice again, exactly the same 3 words. "I see you now." I felt something at that moment that I am not going to dramatize but also will not minimize. A physical discomfort, a slight tightening in the stomach, the same feeling one has when something doesn't fit but doesn't yet know what is wrong. "Do you have any emergency to report?" I asked. The line went dead. I documented the call in the system. Duration, time, originating number, content. The originating number was the first thing that caught my attention when I wrote it down, although I didn't fully process it at that moment. The number had a strange format, with more digits than usual, which the system accepted without marking an error, but that I didn't recognize as any regional prefix I knew. I mentioned the call to Rodrigo during the next break. Rodrigo checked the record on his screen, frowned slightly, and said it was probably a wrong number or someone in an altered state who hung up before being able to speak. He told me that if the same number called again, I should escalate it immediately. It didn't call back that night. I finished my shift at 7, took the bus home, slept until 3 in the afternoon, as was my custom, and upon waking, the call was already in that mental compartment where one keeps the strange things from work that have no clear explanation but also don't require more attention. I stored it there and continued with my week. 4 nights later, on October 20th, it called again. I knew it before the call connected completely, which makes no logical sense, and yet it was so. Something in the way the tone sounded in my headset, some imperceptible difference in sound quality, made me know before seeing the number on the screen that it was the same call. I saw the number. It was the same, the one with the extra digits, the one in the format I didn't recognize. "Emergency center, what is your situation?" Silence. I waited 10 seconds before speaking again. The room around me remained the same, Javier and Paula at their posts, Rodrigo in the supervision room at the back, the white lights, the hum of the equipment. "I'm listening," I said. The voice came through without pause this time, the same words, the exact same tone, as if it were a recording. "I can see you now." "Who is speaking?" I asked, deviating from protocol. Silence. "What is your name?" Silence. And then something different from the previous times. Something that made me instinctively take off my headphones. The same automatic gesture one makes when a sound is too loud. It wasn't a loud sound. It was something else. A sound that shouldn't exist on a phone call. It was as if someone was breathing, yes, but the breathing had something superimposed, something beneath it, like another frequency of sound that the phone wasn't designed to transmit but somehow was transmitting anyway. He ended the call before I could do anything else. I was left with the headphones in my hand, looking at the screen where the number had disappeared from the active log. I went to look for Rodrigo, I told him about the second call with all the details, including the discomfort that sound at the end had caused me. Rodrigo listened attentively, checked the record, and frowned more intensely than the first time. "This number," he said, pointing at the screen, "I'm going to try to trace it. Does it have the correct format for the system?" "The system accepted it," Rodrigo said, "but technically it shouldn't have accepted it. It has 4 extra digits for any national or international numbering format that I know of." He spent a few minutes searching in the system and in additional databases. In the end, he looked up. "There is no record of this number in any active database," he said. "This technically cannot exist. And yet it called twice?" "And yet it called twice," Rodrigo confirmed. "She told me she was going to report it to the technical team in the morning, that it was probably a system error or some kind of interference generating a false number. She told me that if I called back I shouldn't hang up, that I should keep the line open for as long as I could." That week I slept poorly. Not dramatically, not with nightmares or anything I could pinpoint precisely. I slept, but the sleep was not restful. I would wake up with a fatigue that didn't correspond to the hours slept, with a vague feeling of having been somewhere during those hours that wasn't exactly rest. On Thursday I spoke with Paula, the other operator on the night shift. I didn't tell her about the calls. I just asked her in general if she had ever received calls that she couldn't trace, numbers that the system accepted but that didn't exist in any database. Paula looked at me for a moment before responding. "Once," she said, "about a year ago." "What happened?" "Nothing," she said. "The technical team said it was a system error and they closed it. But the call was strange." "How strange?" Paula hesitated. "The person who called knew my name," she said. "I didn't give it to them. They just asked for me. They asked, 'Is Paula there?' And when I said it was me, they hung up. I was left in silence processing that." "And nothing else happened?" I asked. "No," Paula said. "They never called again. But I had some strange days afterward. A feeling that someone was watching me, that kind of thing. It passed." I didn't ask her more. The third call came on October 25th, a Tuesday, at 1:48 in the morning. This time I was prepared, in the sense that I had consciously decided to keep the line open and gather everything I could. I had the secondary recorder active, something that the protocol allowed for calls under investigation, and I had Rodrigo alerted that if the number appeared again, I would signal him immediately. When the tone rang, I looked towards the supervision room. Rodrigo was looking at his screen with a concentrated expression. He had seen it too. I accepted the call. Emergency center. Silence. I mentally counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. At 5 seconds, the voice. "I can see you." "Where are you seeing me from?" I asked, deliberately direct. Silence. "Are you in a place where you need help?" "Nothing." "Can you give me an address?" And then something happened that was not in either of the 2 previous calls. The voice answered my question, not with an address, with something else. "You already know where I am," he said. "My name." He said my name before that phrase, before the "you," which transformed the entire sentence into something that hit me physically in the chest with an efficiency I didn't expect. "How does he know my name?" I asked. The breathing, the sound of breath underneath, louder this time, clearer, that frequency that shouldn't exist on a phone line. "Sophia," the voice said, "just my name, just that." And he hung up. I took off my headphones. My hands were completely still, which I noticed because I would have expected them to tremble and they didn't. It was a physical calm that didn't correspond to what I felt inside, where something had tightened very hard and wouldn't quite loosen. Rodrigo came out of the supervision room and came straight to my desk. "I heard it," he said. "He recorded everything. He knows my name." "Yes." "Rodrigo, how can he know my name?" Rodrigo did not respond immediately. He kept staring at the screen where the number had disappeared again from the active log. Then he said something I didn't expect. "Because it's not the first time this number has called this center." I looked at him. "What?" "I searched the file when you reported the second call," Rodrigo said. "This number, or something that the system records identically to this number, appears in the history. Old calls, very old." "How old?" Rodrigo looked at me. "The oldest record I found is from 19 years ago," he said. This center has been in operation for 21 years. I processed that. And what did the record from 19 years ago say? The same as now, Rodrigo said, in a voice that had lowered in volume without him seeming to notice. Brief call. No traceable location information. Audio content described as incomprehensible in the records from that time because it wasn't transcribed then, and the number with the same impossible format. How many times does it appear in the history? 4 times in 19 years, he said, always with months of difference between calls, always on the night shift, always answered by a different operator. What happened to the operators who answered it before? Rodrigo took a while to respond. 2 resigned within the month following the call. He said, I have no follow-up on the 3rd because the personnel file from that time is incomplete. And the 4th? The 4th is me, Rodrigo said. I stayed looking at him. 7 years ago, he said. It was new then. I was an operator, not a supervisor. I took a call from this number. He said the same words. He mentioned my name. And the next day when I went to report it, they told me that the record showed I had never taken that call. That the records from that night had no entry with that number. And now it does appear? Now it does appear, Rodrigo said. This time I recorded it before he arrived. We have the audio. We have the record. It's not going to disappear from the system. What do you think it is? I asked. Rodrigo took a moment to respond. He was a practical, technical man, one of those who found explanations before invoking mysteries. I don't know, he finally said, and in his voice there was something I hadn't heard before in the months I had been working with him. Something that resembled, without being exactly, adult fear that was well contained. But what I do know is that in the 2 documented cases where the operator continued to take calls after the contact, the calls continued, more frequently, and with more information. What kind of information? Things they shouldn't know, he said. Personal things, about the operator's life outside of this place. I fell silent. What did those operators do? One ignored the calls for 3 weeks until he resigned, Rodrigo said. The other tried to answer them, tried to trace the origin, tried to understand what it was. That's the one I don't have complete follow-up on. What does it mean to not have complete follow-up? That the personnel file ends abruptly, Rodrigo said. No resignation letter, no documented dismissal. He just stops appearing. I finished my shift that night in silence. I did my job, answered the calls that came in, documented everything correctly. But a part of my mind was elsewhere, processing what Rodrigo had told me, piecing together and breaking down the information in search of an interpretation that made sense in terms I could handle. I didn't find it. On the bus ride home as the city dawned around me with that gray and cold light of October mornings in Lima, I thought about the words of the voice. I see you already. You already know where I am. And my name, said with a familiarity I hadn't earned, that no one had given him. I thought about what it meant for something to be able to see you without you being able to see it. That it knew your name without you having given it. That it called from a number that didn't exist in any database of the known world, but that the system accepted anyway, as if the system recognized something that the humans in charge of it did not recognize. That afternoon, instead of sleeping, I called my mother. I didn't tell him anything about the calls. We only talked about normal things for half an hour, about my brother, about plans for the end-of-year parties, about a movie my mother had seen and wanted to recommend to me. Real, concrete things, anchored in the world I knew and in which I moved with confidence. When I hung up, I felt somewhat better. But that night, before heading out for my shift, I checked the message group of the night shift operators, where we sometimes shared practical notices about work. There was a message from Rodrigo sent 2 hours earlier. It said, "The technical team reviewed the audio from last night. They say there is a problem with the recording, that there is interference in the frequencies that they cannot explain, and that the file is corrupted. There is nothing recoverable." Below that message, sent an hour later, there was another from Rodrigo. The call log also disappeared from the system. I stared at the phone for a good while. Then I wrote a message in the group saying that I wouldn't be able to attend the shift that night for personal reasons. I expressed my regret and mentioned that I would notify about the following days. The next day, I submitted my resignation in writing, without providing detailed reasons, citing personal reasons. The human resources process went smoothly. My human resources supervisor, who was not Rodrigo but a person from the day shift, wished me luck, and told me that I had been a good employee. I never returned. 3 years have passed. I now work at a telecommunications company, daytime shift, no emergency calls, no calls from impossible numbers. I sleep at night. My life is completely normal in every verifiable sense. But there is something I haven't been able to resolve, that lives in some corner of my mind that I occasionally peek into unwillingly and quickly pull away from. If the voice said I see you now, and if what it said is true, then it doesn't matter that I change jobs. It doesn't matter that I stop taking those calls. Because what it sees does not see the operator on duty. It sees Sophia. And Sophia is still me. In any job, in any shift, in any place I am. I don't know what called those nights in October. I don't know where it was calling from, nor how it had my name, nor why it chooses certain people and not others, nor what would have happened if I had continued answering its calls. There are things for which I have no answer, and I have learned to live with that. What I do have is a rule, simple and absolute, that I apply in my life without exception since that early morning. If something that shouldn't know your name says it, don't confirm that you heard it. Don't respond. Don't let them know that it arrived. End of Sophia's testimony. She wrote to me that Rodrigo also resigned a few weeks after she left, although she didn't give details about why. She says they haven't spoken since then, and that she prefers it to stay that way. There are experiences that one shares better with strangers than with those who live them by their side, because the stranger can listen without carrying the weight of having lived it too. If you have a story that you've kept hidden, whether it's about work, childhood, a place, or a person you could never explain, write to me. I love receiving them. And if you're coming to the channel for the first time, there are many more stories waiting. Take care a lot tonight. I want to warn you about something before starting this story. It's one of those that stays with you. A follower named Gabriel from Argentina sent it to me, and when I read it, I had to pause halfway to catch my breath for a moment. Gabriel is 43 years old, a rural doctor, and what he describes happened in a town in the province of Corrientes, where he was assigned for a year. A town where the neighbors had a relationship with the dead that Gabriel did not expect to find, and where he discovered that there are people who don't fully leave even though one believes they have already gone. If you're hearing this for the first time, welcome. And if you have your own story kept away, you know where to find me. Let's go with Gabriel's account. I arrived in Paso Oscuro in July with a medium suitcase, my medical bag, and the conviction that a year in the countryside would do me good. I was 36 years old then. I had been working in hospitals in Buenos Aires for almost a decade, in emergencies, in the kind of environment where time always runs too fast and where one ends up treating symptoms instead of people. The exhaustion I had accumulated was not just physical, although that too, but a deeper one, that of someone who has lost the ability to see the patient as something more than a problem to be solved. I needed distance. I needed silence. I needed to remember why I had chosen this profession. The Rural Doctors Program assigned me to Paso Oscuro in the northeast of Corrientes, near the border with Paraguay. A village of 300 people without a hospital, with a small first aid room that depended on the on-duty doctor to function. The previous doctor had requested a transfer after 8 months without giving too many explanations. That should have told me something, but at that moment I read it as a personal incompatibility with isolation, something that in my state of exhaustion seemed completely understandable. The village was exactly what I imagined and also completely different. The low houses, the red dirt roads, the humid heat of July that in Corrientes does not mean winter, but a toned-down version of summer. The nearby river that could be heard at night. The birds I didn't know, with sounds that took me weeks to learn to identify. The people were kind but measured, the kind of kindness that is earned over time, not through presence. I settled into the house that the municipality had designated for the doctor, a modest but comfortable building, with a backyard that opened up to an open field where, on the first nights, I would sit and gaze at a sky with more stars than I had seen in years. My main contact in the village was the nurse in the ward, a woman named Teresa, about 50 years old, a lifelong resident of Corrientes, with a practical knowledge of local medicine that far exceeded any theoretical training. Teresa knew who had what, which herbs families used before coming to the ward, and which customs of the village were better respected without questioning them too much. She explained that last part to me in our first work conversation. Dr. Gabriel, he said to me with that tone of his that mixed warmth with frankness without either yielding to the other. Here people have their ways of healing, ways of dying, ways of mourning. If you come with the idea that everything that is not textbook medicine is ignorance, you are going to have a very difficult year. I told him that I wasn't coming with that idea. Teresa looked at me for a moment, as if evaluating the statement. "Good," she said. "Then we will get along well." And we got along well during the first few weeks. I learned the rhythm of the town, the frequent patients, the common pathologies of the area. I learned to read the Corrientes weather, which could change in hours from a blue summer sky to a storm that shook the roof sheets for hours. I learned to sleep with the heat and with the sounds of the countryside that at first kept me alert, and that over time became as familiar as silence. The first month was exactly what I had gone to look for. The first sign that Paso Oscuro had something I did not expect to find came in the third week when Mr. Agustin died. Don Agustin was the oldest man in the village, 92 years old, with a medical history that was basically a summary of everything that can survive a human body if it has enough will. I had attended to him twice in my first weeks for minor issues, and he seemed to me to be one of those men who seem impossible to die because they have lived for so long that death seems to have forgotten about them. He died at night in his bed, apparently without pain, according to what his daughter told me when she came to inform me the next morning. I went to certify the death, as is proper. Don Agustin's house was large and old, with that particular smell of spaces inhabited for decades by the same person. A mix of old tobacco, wood, and something sweet that I couldn't identify. What caught my attention was not the dead man, of whom I had seen enough in my years of emergencies, but what I found in the room. All the mirrors were covered, not with improvised fabrics, but with dark fabrics that clearly existed for that purpose, kept for when the moment arrived, placed with a precision that indicated practice. The windows were also partially covered, allowing light in but not the view from outside. And on the floor, around the bed, there was a continuous line of something that at first I thought was salt, but when I bent down to check turned out to be a mixture of salt with other things I couldn't identify. Small seeds. Something dark that could have been burnt earth, crushed, dried herbs. Don Agustin's daughter, a lady in her 60s named Elisa, watched me as I looked at all this with an expression that mixed courtesy with something that could have been caution. "It's the custom," she simply said, as if anticipating my question. "What is the line on the floor for?" I asked, trying to maintain a neutral tone. "So that Mr. Agustin knows where he is," Elisa said. "So that he doesn't get confused and stays when he has to leave." I didn't ask any more at that moment. I did my job, signed what I had to sign, and left. That afternoon I asked Teresa about what I had seen. Teresa listened and then took a moment before responding with that gesture of hers of someone who chooses their words carefully. "Here the dead are important," she said. "Not in the way you are thinking. It's not just mourning, it's not just respect. It's that here people know from generations of experience that there are dead who do not leave on their own, that they need help to go, and there are dead who do not want to leave." "And the line on the ground?" "It's to guide them," Teresa said. "Salt and other things. It marks the path out. If the dead rise before being taken, the line indicates where they should exit." "If the dead rise," I repeated. Teresa looked at me. "Dr. Gabriel, I have been in this town for 50 years. I have seen things that are not in any medical book. And I have learned that when the people here do something I don't understand, there is usually a good reason behind it." I didn't say anything more on the subject, but I started to pay more attention. In the following weeks, I noticed things that had previously gone unnoticed in the noise of the first days. The wakes in Paso Oscuro always lasted exactly 2 nights, never less. During those 2 nights, someone was always awake next to the body, without exception, regardless of the hour. The windows of the mourning houses always had a candle lit visible from the street, and no one, absolutely no one, spoke the name of the deceased aloud during the 3 days following the burial. I asked Teresa about that last part. "If you name him, you call him," she said. "And if he hasn't finished leaving yet, he comes. Has that happened?" Teresa looked at me for a long moment. "Yes," she said. She didn't elaborate. And something in the way she said it indicated to me that was the limit of what she was going to share at that moment. 2 more months passed without any event that deviated from what I had begun to consider the normal range of dark passage. Dead with their rituals, customs that I respected without fully understanding, Teresa, who taught me the ways of the village with the patience of someone used to introducing strangers to a world that is not their own. Then Mrs. Ramona died. Ramona was 78 years old and had been, according to Teresa, the most respected person in the village for decades. Not for an official position, but for knowledge. She was the one who knew. She knew about plants, bodies, dreams, and the dead. People would go to see her before going to the doctor for certain things, and Teresa, with an honesty I always appreciated, told me directly on the first day, "There are things for which they come to you, and things for which they went to Ramona. And the things of Ramona you cannot attend to even if you want to." Ramona died on a Wednesday in September. Her grandson found her in the morning, in her bed, apparently at peace. I went to certify the death as always. Ramona's house was different from the others in the village. Larger, with an inner courtyard full of plants that grew with a density and health that seemed to defy the dry heat of September, with a number of objects on the walls and shelves that told decades of life. The mirrors were covered. The line of salt and herbs surrounded the bed, everything according to custom. But there was something else in Don Agustin's house. On Ramona's chest they had placed an object. It was not a religious object in the conventional sense. It was something handmade, from materials that I could not identify all, with a shape that had something of a cross, but also something of another thing, something older than the cross. Ramona's grandson, a young man of about 20 named Nico, watched me as I looked at it. "So that Grandma can leave in peace," he said. "She prepared it herself a long time ago. She said that when her time came, it had to be placed there." "Did she know she was going to die soon?" Nico looked at me with an expression that mixed the pain of mourning with something harder to describe. "Grandma knew many things," he said. "She used to say that what worried her most about dying was not being able to leave properly, that there are things that cling on." "What kind of things?" Nico hesitated. "She dealt with things that are not from this side," he finally said, "her whole life. And she said that when you work with those things, sometimes they leave a mark, and that mark can make it difficult to pass on." I kept thinking about that for the rest of the day. Ramona's wake was different from the others I had witnessed in the town. More people, more silence, a solemnity that exceeded normal mourning. Teresa was present the entire first night. I stayed for a while, offered my respects, and left at midnight. It was on the second night of the wake when everything changed. It was 2 in the morning when they knocked on my door. It was Nico. He had the face of someone who has seen something they cannot process, an expression of bewilderment rather than fear, like when reality does something that is not in any of your frameworks to interpret it. "Doctor, you have to come," he said. "What happened?" "Grandma." I went without asking more. Ramona's house was full of people, all those who had been keeping vigil, all standing, all looking towards the room where the body was. No one spoke. The silence had a texture I had never experienced before, something that was not just absence of sound but an active presence, as if the silence itself had weight. Teresa was near the door of the room. When she saw me arrive, she gestured with her head, which I interpreted as "come." I entered the room. Ramona was in her bed, exactly as I had left her hours before, with the object on her chest, surrounded by the line on the floor. Nothing visibly different, but the object on her chest had changed position, not dramatically. Just a few centimeters, a slight turn, as if someone had moved it carefully. But no one had entered the room since I had left, Teresa told me in a very low voice when she approached. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Sure," she said. "There's always someone watching." No one came in. "And the line?" Teresa pointed with her eyes. I looked at the floor. The line was intact on 3 sides of the bed. On the 4th side, the one facing the window, there was an interruption, a small arc, as if something the size of a foot had rested on the line from the inside. From inside the perimeter marked by the line, from where the body was. I stood completely still, staring at that. "What does it mean?" I asked. Teresa took a while to respond. "Ramona is still here," she said. "Or something of Ramona. She didn't finish leaving." "And what do we do?" Teresa looked at me. "There is a person in the village who knows what to do in this case," she said. but that person was Ramona. The silence that followed that sentence lasted several seconds. Is there no one else? There is a woman in a village 40 kilometers away, Teresa said. But I don't know if she'll make it in time. Time for what? The second night is always the critical one, Teresa said. If something doesn't finish leaving after the second night, it stays. And something that stays without wanting to can cause harm without intending to. They sent for the woman from the 40-kilometer village. She arrived at dawn, a lady of about 70 years whom they simply called the aunt, with a leather bag full of things she didn't show me and that I didn't ask about. She entered the room, asked everyone to leave, and closed the door. We waited outside for almost an hour. When the aunt came out, she had an expression of deep fatigue, the kind that doesn't come from staying up all night, but from something more demanding. It's done, she said. Ramona left well. No one asked for details. Neither did I. But before the aunt left, while waiting outside with her leather bag, I approached to talk to her. I don't know exactly why. Something about that woman, in her way of moving and speaking, generated in me the same kind of respect that doctors with decades of clinical experience do, someone who has seen so much that they no longer need to prove it. I asked her what had happened exactly. Aunt looked at me for a moment before responding. Then she said something I have thought about many times since then. Ramona spent her life working on the boundary between this side and the other. And when one works on that boundary, part of oneself learns to be on both sides at the same time. When Ramona died, that part didn't want to let go. Not out of malice, just out of habit. She had to be convinced that it was no longer necessary. And how do you convince that? With respect, said the aunt. With the right words. And reminding her that there is more on the other side than here. She left before I could ask her anything else. I finished my year in Paso Oscuro in July as planned. I didn't ask for an extension. I didn't ask for an early transfer. I lived the full 12 months and left when it was time. In that year, I learned things that are not in any medical book and that I could not explain in terms that would satisfy a colleague from Buenos Aires. I learned that there are ways to die that require more care than others. I learned that Teresa's knowledge of the body included dimensions that I had not studied. I learned that some customs that at first seemed like superstition turned out to have a functionality that I could not ignore after what I saw. But there is one thing in particular that I brought back from Paso Oscuro that I cannot shake off. The night after Aunt did what she did in Ramona's room, I went home as dawn was beginning to break. I was exhausted in a way that was not just physical. I sat in the backyard watching the field gradually light up with the early light, and I had the feeling that someone was standing behind me. That's interesting. Sometimes our minds play tricks on us, especially in the early morning when we're still waking up. It could have been just a shadow or a trick of the light. Ramona respected you, doctor. She said you were one of those who know how to listen even if they don't understand, that it's rare. Do you think it was Ramona that I felt? Teresa thought before answering. I think Ramona left well, he said. Aunt did well. But sometimes before leaving completely, those who are leaving pass through the places and people that mattered to them. Just to say goodbye. I don't know if I believe that. I'm a doctor. I'm a person of scientific training. I have every reason in the world to seek rational explanations for everything I experience. And yet there are things I lived in Paso Oscuro that don't fit into any explanation that completely satisfies me. I came to that town to recover something I had lost in the years of emergencies. The ability to see patients as whole people, as complex stories, not just as symptoms. And I recovered it, although in ways I didn't expect. I also brought back something I didn't ask for, but that I can't return either. The certainty, which comes from having been present and having seen with my own eyes, that there are things on the edge of life and death that the medicine I studied does not cover. I don't know exactly what those things are. But now, when I have a patient who is near the end, I am more careful, more attentive, more willing to take seriously things that I would have dismissed before. And when someone tells me that there are dead who need help to leave, it no longer allows me to smile with superiority. I just nod, because I have been in the yard of a house in Corrientes at dawn, and something has looked at me before dissolving into the light. And I don't forget that. So far, the story of Gabriel. He wrote to me that he continues practicing medicine, now in a provincial clinic, far from the emergencies of Buenos Aires that exhausted him. He says that Teresa and he write to each other from time to time, and that the town remains the same, with its customs and its dead well cared for. What stuck with me the most from his story is that idea that respect for what we do not understand can be more useful than trying to explain everything. Sometimes the oldest wisdom has reasons that science has yet to name. If you have a story that comes from your family, from your town, from a tradition that always seemed more real to you than you could admit, write to me. I would love to narrate it. Good night, and sleep well.